I would, the issue, of course, in the webinar is can peacebuilding work with case studies of Mali, Somalia, and Sudan, right, Sudan. And we have three experts in the field to spend 15 minutes each on the speaking to this issue. And I'll introduce them in order of their presentations. Khalid Ahmed is teaches African Studies at Innis College at the University of Toronto, and has done an enormous amount of research on peace building and peace negotiations in Sudan in particular, but more generally in sub-Saharan Africa. I also say that I have known Khalid for probably close to 20 years. I haven't added them up, but he started off in my first year class on the politics of development many years ago, and it's been wonderful to have this association with him for so many years. So he will spend 5 minutes talking about what peace building is, and then 10 minutes talking mainly about the case of Mali. Vladimir Zhagora is our second panelist, and he had an initial career as an academic in Belarus for a decade, and then went to the United Nations, where he worked for 30 years in the UN Secretariat, Department of Political Affairs, responsible for peace negotiations and conflict resolution in a variety of African countries, about 9 or 10 as far as I know, playing very central role in trying to mediate disputes, forward peace agreements, has an enormously rich experience in this area of peace building in Africa. He's also, of course, a member of our board, so we're very pleased to have him both on the board and also on this panel tonight.
Thank you.
We'll be speaking mainly about Somalia and the difficulties of creating a security system in that country. The third speaker is Ann McKenna, who is Executive Director of Partera International, and she has 30 years of experience working in conflict zones around the world. And she has, for one thing, run training sessions on skills in nonviolent direct action, conflict analysis, and third-party nonviolent intervention in the Sudan, among other places. And tonight, we'll be talking mainly about her experiences in Sudan and to some extent in South Sudan. So those are our three speakers. Before turning to them, I would like to recognize that we have among us tonight a fourth expert on peace building, and that is Bob Matthews, until now a member of our board, and the founder of the course on peace building at the University of Toronto. He was himself the chair of political science at the University of Toronto for many years. He has had done a lot of several written books and edited books on peacemaking and peace building in various African countries, and has taught hundreds of students in this area who are now found all over the world, and many of them involved in positions in which they're actually promoting peace negotiations. So Bob Matthews, we're so happy to have you on the board, and thank you very much for coming this evening. So now let's turn to the first speaker, if I may, and that is Khalid Ahmed, to say something about the concept of peace building before moving on to the case of Mali. Khalid, please take the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. And indeed, we go a very long way back since we met back in 2000. And I must have the humility to confess that most of what I've learned about Africa and peace and development in Africa. I've learned it from Richard Sambrook and Bob Matthews. And I'm very happy to see you here, Bob. I'm glad that you're participating in this. Thank you for being here and making the time. And I would also like to thank everyone for attending today. That's a wonderful turnout, indeed. Okay, now I want to talk about the theoretical aspects of peace in general, and I would like to explain a few points, and I might also try to be the devil advocate here and to stir up some conversations and discussions. So hopefully we will elaborate on that more during the question and answer period. Peace processes as we know it today, and as we're going to be talking about it, me and my colleagues who are going to be presenting today, is mostly based on the agenda for peace that was developed by the late Boutros Ghali, the former Secretary of the United Nations, in 1992, which really conceptualizes peace as a form of, as a tool to really empower countries and to develop them and to get to, and he made it so in a way, and I'm going to be talking in a rather brief manner, in a way that would allow me to say as much as possible during a short period of time. And if there's anything that is unclear, please ask me later. But Boutros Ghali have proposed back in 1992 that the peace processes are supposed to, or are made of 4 different components. The first is preventative diplomacy. And the reason for it, the purpose of it is to try to prevent countries from falling into crisis and in civil wars. So in other words, to try to prevent countries from falling into civil wars and catch the civil strife before it actually ignites into a full-fledged war. Now, preventative diplomacy is followed by peacemaking in case that the war did slip into the countries, or the country did slip into war. Peacemaking is supposed to be the process that negotiates and the differences between the gaps and mediates them in a way that would ensure the allocation of enough resources and power sharing, such as power sharing, wealth sharing, and addressing the grievances that led people in the first place to pick up arms and fight. In other words, it's supposed to be addressing the root causes of the problem. Now, that is supposed to be followed by the third element of Boutros Ghali's agenda, which is peacekeeping. That is a United Nations force that is comprised of many different countries volunteering or sending their troops to participate in maintaining and ensuring that the peace agreement actually does hold, and that it is the right environment is created for the following 4th and last peace process, which is the peace building process, which is the topic of our discussion today. And the peace building, the purpose of the peace building process, it was envisioned as the process where the countries will truly develop the institutional capacity, the necessary mechanisms to resolve conflicts in a peaceful way, and also economic, political, and social development, and create the right environment for all different groups, regardless of who they are, regardless of religion, race, ethnicity, any differences, to share the powers and the wealth together of the country. In other words, this is the part where you would implement the peace agreement and ensure that peace is being built. And it is very similar to its counterpart, the preventative diplomacy that I mentioned earlier, because peace building is supposed to prevent countries from falling into the trap of war again and the recurrence of war. So peace building is a very important aspect, and it's the one that gets most attention from international scholars and practitioners as well, because they deem it as a very important segment of peace that really is concerned with dividing the pie equally and fairly amongst all people. However, the practice of peace building has been contested in many different ways by different people and different scholars, even practitioners. The most apparent critique that peace building has received is the fact that it really is a form of intervention that Western countries at the expense of the locals. And they claim that to understand peace building, you need to understand how the West defines peace and how and who is building it in that country. So peace here is defined as the liberal peace, which is now being critiqued as a form of peace that promotes liberalization, privatization, marketization, free trade, shrinking role of the state, and so forth. Now, having such peace building practices and policies, people realize, the scholars and practitioners both realize, that many of the causes of the war in the first place do not get addressed, and actually the countries fall into the trap of war again. So the critique is neoliberal approaches to peace building are dominating the agenda of peace, and that to really change that, we need to reconceptualize the way we understand peace and the way we address it, and the economic policies that comes with it, in a way that is reflective of the needs of those at the local level and not those of the Western perspectives and ontologies and epistemologies. Now, what does that really mean? So, for example, the Western as I mentioned, Western agencies now promoting and working for peace directly try to implement policies that promotes growth through free trade. As I mentioned earlier, this is problematic because free trade, according to them, free trade is supposed to promote growth, and growth promotes international or global integration in the global capitalist economy. However, the very same countries, such as the United States or the UK or France, did it in a very different way. Their integration to the international global economy did not come through free trade. It came through, first, protectionist policies that allowed the local industries in the countries to flourish, and then these local industries developed and led to a specific type of growth that benefited the locals, and then they were ready to be integrated into international community, global economy. So this is a problem, and that needs to be addressed, and hopefully we will get to talk about later on. And one of the most salient policies that are problematic also, that I neglected to mention earlier, is that the fact that the shrinking role of the states leads to less subsidies for the poor, and the shrinking role of the welfare state and so forth. So the state is no longer playing its historical role of taking care of and maintaining the welfare of its people. Now, let me move into Mali, and I'll leave it at this now and introduce Mali. The Malian case is a very interesting case, and also talks that started back with the French colonialism, when they first drew up Mali in 1891. And when they were doing that, they formed all these kingdoms and empires that was at the region, and formed what was known at the time as French Sudan. Now, just before independence, the Tuareg, which is the main rebel group that we will be talking about in this Mali case, in the Malian case, is an ethnic group that is occupying the northern part of Mali and the southern part of the Sahara Desert in Algeria, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and Mauritania. So they live in all these regions, and they were promised by the French at the time to form a state amongst all of them, to combine all these regions and form a state. However, France abandoned this plan, and the exclusion of the Tuareg from the future Malian state led to a lot of the political grievances that still exist today. So Mali got its independence in 1960. Immediately after that, the Tuareg started a rebellion demanding secession from the Malian state. And by 1964, this rebellion was squashed, but brutally squashed and brutally ended. And many of their women were raped and murdered, and they were treated in a very inhumane way that added to the problem rather than end the demand for secession. But to move forward, and Mali then, from 1964 until 1990, since independence actually, until 1992, Mali has been dominated by authoritarian states a single party state. And these authoritarian states obviously did not really respond to the needs of the Tuareg and northern part of Mali, their grievances and their marginalization that they have been complaining about. So in 1990, the Tuareg again picked up arms, and the rebellion and uprising caused the fall of the dictator at the time, Traoré, and the beginning of Mali's first democratic era, with the first president elected in 1992, in 1991, sorry, and then in 1992, a peace agreement was signed with the Tuareg that granted them some sort of autonomy, but it wasn't really called an autonomy, but it gave them some local control and local elections and so forth. And it's very important to mention how this is called, it wasn't really labeled as a autonomy or federalism, because that happens again back in 2015. Now, the mandates of this agreement was not implemented until 1996. And unfortunately, immediately after that, the war broke again between the two because of the lack of trust and the absence of genuine will to develop and to really implement the mandates from both sides. Moving forward to 2011, the Tuareg again picked up arms. Mali has been plagued all along with drought and severe poverty. It's in fact, it's the 179 poorest country in the world, according to the UNDP Human Development Index. So it's one of the poorest countries in the world. And this also contributed to the fact that the Tuareg again picked up arms with the drought that was happening periodically in their region, in their Sahara region. So they picked up arms, they took control of northern Mali this time. Large parts of the Malian state fell under their power, and they declared actually in April 6th an independent state of Azwad, they call it Azwad. So their region is called Azwad, and they declared independence. Of course, they didn't receive any recognition from any country in the world. But that led to, immediately after that, they were fighting, they had an internal fight with the Islamists who were returning from Libya after the fall of the Gaddafi regime. These Tuareg were incorporated into the Libyan army, but when the Gaddafi fell in Libya, they all returned home with heavy arms and heavy weapons, and they continued the fight. They formed the major group that really demanded the secession in 2012. But then they at the same time, many of these Islamists came to the region as well, from Libya and Algeria and other parts, and they started fighting with these Tuareg for control of over northern Mali. This continued on until 2011 and 2015. Which in between 2012 and 2015, the French intervened militarily, and ECOWAS, which is the East African Economic Region, also intervened in the Malian case, internationalizing the case. I mean, the war and the efforts to end the war. But by 2015, it was not just the Tuareg anymore. So what you hear today in the news is about Mali and destabilization and violence. It's not really the Tuareg, it's mostly the extremists who are not happy with the fact that the French intervened and ended their control over the northern parts. As I mentioned earlier, by the end of 2012, the Islamists and actually got control and held control over the northern parts of Mali. And they even ventured southwards towards the central part of Mali. And when the French intervened, everything ended. Their control of the region ended, and they were chased out. Over a million people were displaced in neighboring countries as refugees, and hundreds of thousands died in the conflict. France now has over 5,000 troops there. The UN has over 13,000 peacekeepers trying to resolve the conflict. I mean, trying to maintain.
May I interrupt to say that, could you try and?
Yes.
2 more minutes?
I know. I have a timer here, so I'm going over it quickly. So what is happening now is a peace agreement that has been signed and not implemented because of the inability of the people to really create the right environment conducive to the peace agreement and conducive to peace itself. And that has created a lot of problems with the international community, who was hoping that the region will be stabilized, but it's not stabilized, and that it is going to continue problematically to disturb not just Mali, but neighboring countries such as Burkina Faso. We'll talk about how this failure, or what are the specific failures of the peace agreement. Mostly is the fact that the leadership is lacking between those who are fighting the government. And the peace agreement was signed between three factions. The first is called the Platform of Armed Groups, which is pro-Malian state, but they ask for an autonomy. And the Azawad group, which is fighting for secession, and the Malian state. There is a huge discrepancy between these two factions who signed the peace agreement, and the major discrepancy and the major difference between them is the fact that one is asking for secession and the other one is asking for a unitary state within the, more autonomy within the unitary state in Mali. So a lot of spoilers sprang up, a lot of people unhappy with the peace agreement and so forth. So there is not enough local and grassroots support for the peace agreement, and therefore a lot of problems are expected and are happening right now as we speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Khalid. Let's move on now to Vladimir and Somalia.
Thank you, Richard. Good evening, everybody. Once again, it's really a challenging thing, quite frankly, to provide you with a synopsis of what peace building is and was about in Somalia. And I'll try to explain why within these 15 minutes that I'm given to present the case. I have first to stress a couple of things to reinforce the arguments that were given by Khalid at the very beginning, that the issue of assessing the efficiency of peace building is quite important. We, as you know, as we discuss this problem, the United Nations is finalizing the process of reviewing the peace-building architecture, which they started in 2016, when the General Assembly of the United Nations and the Security Council adopted simultaneously separate resolutions requesting the Peace-Building Commission and the Secretary General to work on a report which should be presented, was supposed to be presented literally in July this year at the 74th session of the General Assembly. And that report, according to the requests contained in the resolution, should present by itself a detailed account in connection with the next comprehensive review of peace-building architecture, I'm quoting here, focusing on the progress in the implementation of the recommendations which were contained in the report on peace building and sustaining peace in 2018. So it doesn't seem to be the case now that we are going to have a full discussion of this report, but it's expected to be out sometime next month. Now, the objective of the review of the peace-building architecture was to take stock of the work done by the United Nations only in peace-building, while the process as such in its complexity and in terms of its universality, of course, goes beyond the system of the United Nations. But United Nations is the key organization which collectively is assigned to deal with matters of peace building since the time when the report by Boutros Boutros-Ghali was published in 1992, and since at least 2005 when the Peace Building Commission and the United Nations Peace Building Trust Fund were created. So since that, the international efforts, you know, to launch in various countries, and we're talking today about at least 25 different countries in the world, or regions in the world where the peace building initiatives and programs are deployed, so that this process overall globally would be coordinated, harmonized, connected with the civil society, international and regional organizations, businesses, local structures, including the local self-governing governance institutions in various countries and various contexts. So it's a very appropriate timing for our discussion on the matter by taking Mali and Somalia and Sudan as examples, how relevant this process is. And I think in terms of Somalia, one may kind of question the relevance of it, because since 1993, the history of Somalia basically presented a unique example of a state, or very often not a state, but a territory that have seen it all in terms of peacemaking and peace building, with very, very marginal success. And as it appears only now, we can say that that's the history that is unfolding maybe that slowly, but effort indeed has been invested considerable, despite enormous political, financial, humanitarian investments made by the international community. A peaceful and stable Somalia, as it appears every now and then, remains an unachievable goal, or rather an unreachable land. And I would try briefly to describe as to why is it happening so, that Somalia is so difficult to bring and put together and put it on the path of recovery, rehabilitation, peace and stability. Now, I will have to say immediately that I limit whatever I'm going to say about Somalia to only two central matters of peace building. If we look at peace building as a comprehensive strategy, it's the issue of institution state building, and security sector reform is a second issue. And whatever I'm going to present, I will limit my assessment in time. I will speak only about post-2017 developments in Somalia. And in scope, I will be talking mostly about United Nations and African Union, because they are particularly relevant to peace building in Somalia. And of course, I should stress that for decades, the regional organizations such as Intergovernmental Authority on Development, of which Somalia has been the member since 1986, that European Union, Organization of the Islamic Conference, and the League of Arab States, and others were very active. Academia and think tanks also from all over the world constituted a critical part of intellectual and other efforts to help Somalis to support peace building and state building. Now, quickly about the context, because it's very difficult to grasp the difficulties in implementing any peace building strategy in Somalia without having at least a very general glimpse of what Somalia today is up to, what it is about. Current political and security situation in Somalia should be seen as a direct consequence of presidential and legislative electoral processes in Somalia between October 2016 and February 2017. Almost 25 years after the national strife in Somalia started in 1991, the country at last started to move on a strategic kind of highway for the recovery of their statehood, which they basically call, in one word, federalism. It's very well known that Somalia is a country unique in one very important sense. It's the only country in Africa, and probably the only one, or maybe one of the very few ones in the world, who is mono-ethnic by and large, 98% mono-ethnic. It's religiously totally uniform. It's all Sunni Muslim. It is obviously very closely ethnically connected in terms of its immediate neighbors. There are about 2.5–3 million Somalis in Kenya. There are probably as many Somalis in Ethiopia as there in Somalia itself. And the 60% of the population of Djibouti are Somalis. So in itself, it's a very critical matter how this kind of nation, can build itself. It seems to be easy because of what I've just said. But on the contrary, uniting this kind of very close ethnically, linguistically, culturally people appeared to be the very, very difficult task. So now federalism is understood in the context we're talking about as a part of the peace-building strategy for Somalia, is about the relationship between the federal government and the so-called federal member states, of which there are 6, generally speaking. And we are not talking here about what is known as Somaliland, because Somaliland goes its own way. The former British Somalia, you know, develops along its own ways, while the former, so to speak, roughly Italian Somalia goes its own way until today. But that part which used to be mostly Italian, it's now been divided into at least 6 different federal member states, as they are called in all the documents. And the relationship between them is very important, and you know, it's now the main challenge in peace building. There is also the element of the security sector reform, which is also going into institution building directly, is the agreement between the federal state and the federal member states, provincial states in other words, on the national security architecture. Was signed in April 2017, and it was a very important step toward a unified security sector in Somalia for the first time since 1993. And that agreement foresaw the integration of regional forces into Somali National Army and the establishment of federal and member state police forces. However, the political stalemate between this center and the periphery since September 2018 has negatively affected the implementation of the security agreement. Although efforts to restore relations since then have been quite concerted and multiple, constructive political dialogue really between the two sides have not really been resumed. There were contacts of various sorts, including some very important ones recently, very recently, but there is no yet consistent process. Now, given another important thing, if we are talking about the context in which peace building is expected to unfold, you know, given the inherent specifics of the Somali demography, as I described them, and more generally in the Horn of Africa region, given the ethnographic complexity of this region, the number of tribal, migrating, foreign, or even international armed groups of various nature, the Somalia, you know, is one of those countries which is infested with them, and it's a very serious factor which affects both institution, state building, and security sector reform. It just cannot be ignored. And of course, from among many of those, Al-Shabaab remains the main threat to security and stability in Somalia. And you know, the social fabric of the Somali society and the decades-long ungovernability of expanded areas in the country and immediately beyond the borders of internationally recognized borders of Somalia. This kind of ungovernability continuously was inviting extremists of various origin. And this is also the fact today. Since 2017, Al-Shabaab was particularly destructive and active, targeting the African peacekeeping force in Somalia, AMISOM, as well as UN premises, UN facilities and staff. It was using various kind of asymmetrical means of warfare, such as suicide bombings or complex military attacks, cross the border attacks, and so on, basically creating the broad area of instability. So because of that, since about beginning of 2018, the AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, military-based, which is constituted by 5 member states, African states, they were trying to target Al-Shabaab militarily in a consistent manner. And in this sense, the international community, including the United Nations, through its specifically organized facility called United Nations Support Office in Somalia, was trying to help both AMISOM and Somali National Army, as it is called, to minimize the security threat and threat to stability coming from Al-Shabaab. But in its essence, this process of organizing, focused attacks against Al-Shabaab and other militias, foreign militias in Somalia, this process involves a gradual handover of security functions to Somali security forces. And this process is expected to be complete, was expected, I would better put it this way, was expected to be complete by about the end of 2021. Now, another important thing which adds to instability and lack, of success and significant process in the area of security and institution building is the fact that the number of internally displaced in Somalia at the beginning of this year exceeded 2.6 million individuals, almost 2/3 of whom are children. And the main drivers, obviously, of displacement were the conflict, the insecurity, fear of violence, drought, and very recently, the harshest locust pest in the last 25 years. Mm-hmm. Now, we should also have in mind, when we're talking about peace building in Somalia, that there's an international military presence either in Somalia or very close to Somalia. And we're talking here about US Navy in the Indian Ocean, the combined joint task force deployed in Djibouti, which also were organized in coordination with AMISOM to an extent against Al-Shabaab. And they significantly increased their airstrikes in response to recent Al-Shabaab activities. In addition to AMISOM, in addition to US Air Force, neighboring Ethiopia and Kenya deployed their own regular military forces in some parts of Somalia, basically as they claim to resist arms trafficking, cattle rustling, and terrorist threat. Now, I'm coming at last to exactly what I wanted to say. I think I have about 5 minutes remaining, yes?
About 3.
Yeah, about 3. Challenges of peace building in Somalia. Of course, the first challenge is establishment of functioning federal state. It's a core task of the political elites and the people of Somalia. Now, the list of national priorities in this regard, in state building in Somalia, would be rather long even to read out. So this year is critical for Somalia in one important respect: holding credible and timely one-person, one-vote elections. Preparations for universal suffrage elections have been underway since 2018. The legislative enacted the electoral law, but until today's executive authorities, including the Independent Electoral Commission, have not yet formulated regulations needed to make those laws practically implementable. And that's where the international community, including United Nations, is trying to help those institutions to do this job. It's not progressing fast, but it's ongoing. Now, in addition to this, if we have elections and we're getting prepared for elections, we need to have kind of even political playing ground. And the parliament in that regard should adopt the amendments to the political parties law, which is there already for about 2 years in discussions, have not been yet adopted. And it's a critically important thing for any elections to be free and fair. Obviously, the situation with peace building today in Somalia, as everywhere else, is seriously affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I could have, separately talked about it, but we simply don't have time for it. Now, what is very important in terms of elections, connection between election and institution building, is the challenge of establishing a robust electoral security plan. The National Electoral Security Task Force has been created, but it is yet to launch a program of securing the electoral process, including by completing an assessment of securable areas. And that's again where the United Nations, the support office in Somalia, is playing a crucial role in designing, launching, and supporting those efforts by the government. Then, Of course, the government is seriously lacking resources for any activity, and therefore, United Nations Support Office and some of the bilateral donors spent a lot of effort investing into improvement of monetary and budgetary practices of the government. As you know, money has to be disposed and accountable for. And that's where the problem is in Somalia, has always been and still is a problem, accountability of the government. Now we can say that there was some program, because only this year, Somalia reached the decision point in the World Bank and International Monetary Fund heavily indebted poor countries initiative. They will have some access to resources at last. And, you know, I could have continued in the same spirit, but again, given the time, let me just list other significant issues of state and institution building, so that we can then, you know, go to the next stage of our discussion. In addition to the issue of federalism, in addition to the issue of governability, there is an issue of constitutional review in the country, which is also ongoing. This is probably by far the most challenging issue in peace building in Somalia. If implemented, it would ensure the independence of the judiciary branches of government and legislative and executive. In practical terms, we're talking about the establishment and about the operationalization of the Judicial Services Commission in the country, the Constitutional Court, and the Independent National Human Rights Commission. That's again where the international community is actively involved. Prevention and resolution of the conflict, the local one in particular. Human rights and protection of human rights, again, a multifaceted challenge, and so on. Now, the question about efficiency and applicability of the international assistance in the area of state building and security sector reform, you know, let me give you just one example to conclude, because I see that I cannot make it in the remaining time. Against all odds in political and security and humanitarian areas, which, you know, I could elaborate on, in February 2012, during the last parliamentary session before the COVID pandemic, the two houses of the Somali parliament, the House of the People, the lower chamber, and the upper house, approved bills. Just listen to the range of what documents they were, legislative acts they were approving. Bill on civil aviation, bill on quality product control, bill on national census, bill on the national media, bill on the retirement of benefits for armed forces, partial budget bill. Overall, over 20 bills during one parliamentary session. So you can claim that state building is producing some result, albeit, you know, too slow maybe to be happy with that. I stop here and I leave. I still have couple of good ideas about the security sector reform, but I respect the time limits.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. By the way, if anybody has any question or comment, please do hold them. We will have a Q&A session after Ann McKenna has spoken. So our third speaker is Ann, and she's, I believe, speaking mainly about Sudan and nonviolent action training. So Ann, please begin.
Thank you, and my apologies. There was an accident here in the house, and so that I'm explaining my delay in arriving. I'm very sorry, but it demanded attention. So yes, I'm going to be talking about Sudan and South Sudan. And for those of you who are at the VOW gathering, some of this will sound familiar. My work follows two parallel and intersecting trajectories. I work in zones of conflict in training in violence and nonviolent action. The organization for which I work is called Partera, which is Spanish for midwife. And here in Canada, I also do training in equity, race, gender, ability, status, etc. So where do we find peace? How do we find peace? Two things are clear for me through my work. One of those is nonviolence, the absolute necessity of violence, and the other is the indispensable presence of women. My role is to talk about these two countries and the impact of efforts at peace building. And I'd like to offer a snapshot of the methodology that I use that I think is key to successful peace, still elicited, popular, and play-based. So imagine this, it's 2005. The scene is an Episcopalian compound in Omdurman, Sudan, edges of the Darfur Desert, where Omar al-Bashir has ramped up his war on the people of Darfur. 10 Muslims, 10 Christians, sitting in a circle. Not long into that first day of training and following two play-based exercises that have already suggested that this is unlike any training they've ever before, I walk slowly around the circle, effecting a sort of late-term waddle. You are pregnant, I say to them, looking each one of them in the eye. And the women seem okay with this, but perhaps curious, but the men not so much. You are pregnant, I say to them. Everything you ever needed to know has been stating inside of you since forever. Wisdom, story, all of it. And the DNA of what issues from this process is yours, not mine. I'm here simply as your midwife, providing the container within which you will learn. It's yours to name, to nurture, to maturity. The stories are yours, not mine. The solutions are yours, not mine. There's nothing in this method that is not up for interrogation. Race, civics, culture, economics, gender, religion, tribe. And we do so through the dual lenses of what drives violence and what makes for peace. Whether we are doing economic literacy, getting at the true economic roots of violence, gender, identity, rank and privilege, or training in the skills of situational analysis, third-party nonviolent intervention, or direct action, we play. We do extended simulation, role play, street theater, lots of movements that elicit more from them than they imagine possible. And they emerge some weeks later, trained as trainers and transformed, with perhaps the greatest change being their respective women and men understandings of the range of alternative masculinities and femininities. The local organization who owns this program will require of them and support them in 3 additional training of trainers of at least 20 people each, equally divided as much as possible between women and men, Muslims and Christians. And the result, if you do the math, is an exponential growth of trained trainers. As many as 220,000 will put their new skills to work in the streets of Khartoum and beyond, with the goal nothing short of the nonviolent overthrow of a dictator. So I'd like to introduce you to 2 of those trainers. The metaphor of midwife turns out to be important, serving as a permanent invitation to women to place themselves in the midst of processes of peace. In November of 2011, I'm in a restaurant in Juba, the brand new capital of the brand new country of South Sudan. And up on the TV screen appears the image of Widad Darvish and other familiar faces. The Al Jazeera English documentary was called How to Mobilize a Million. Wow, Widad and her friends have been working hard, leafleting, organizing, keeping the serial uprisings nonviolent. And 7 months later, Widad, along with others, 7 months after I saw this documentary, they were arrested and incarcerated in the women's prison in Omdurman. May is there as well. And when I see May some months later, she still bears and will always bear the scars of her imprisonment. She tells me her story. Even if you kill me, she told her captors, there are many more coming up behind me. To her sister prisoners, she taught the skills of nonviolence. There's a baby growing in you, she told them. The new Sudan, it is going to be born. All of these women, they know about you, Haboba, and what we did together, that you gave us the best gift ever, the gift of nonviolence. Look at me, she said. We were on Skype. I am now, so how beautiful I am now that I've been beaten and they have starved me. And she smiles back at me in a very powerful moment. So that was 2012. Forced to leave her beloved Sudan, May now lives in Berlin, where she remains an activist with a national reputation. On her release, Widad continued her dangerous work with those who, in April of last year, secured the first step of their goal with the nonviolent removal of President Omar al-Bashir. They were heady days, with women outnumbering men in the streets on some days, led by Kandaka, Nubian princesses of nonviolence. Tens of thousands stayed camped out in front of the military headquarters, unhappy with the al-Bashir buddy the Transitional Military Council had chosen as interim ruler. A year ago, on the 3rd of June, the TMC ordered the paramilitary rapid support forces to attack the protesters, massacring 120 people. Still, they did not go away. With the force more powerful of nonviolent resistance and the persistence of women who had turned the occupation into a village complete with food preparation, garbage management, sanitary facilities, health and education centers, negotiations led in August to the establishment of a joint sovereign council, with an economist leading the way to the country's transition, though clearly a bumpy road to peace, a road laid by the indispensable presence and leadership of women. Meanwhile, to the south, what can one say? The last time I was actually there was 2013. Longtime partners who had participated in trainings in Sudan had returned to the south, many of them card-carrying members of the SPLM, many of whom became part of the new government. Only a few weeks following South Sudan's independence from the North in July of 2011, the wheels were already falling off. In fact, the years between the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005 and independence were a portend of things to come. As the ministries of the unity government were distributed between the North and the South, Khartoum ensured that the more valuable ministries, oil, for example, remained in the hands of the North. As oil was contributing an increasingly large percentage of the budget, Omar al-Bashir was keen to disrupt Southern access to oil. Militia violence on both sides contributed to a period that was anything but nation building. During those years, as the South prepared for independence, tribal divides reasserted themselves as groups struggled for ascendancy one against the other. Nepotism was a key component as appointments were distributed mainly between the two largest tribes, Nuer and Dinka, with often little value placed on literacy or competencies. The multilaterals poured into Juba along with every NGO, Ingo, and Gongo, each of whom wanted offices, housing, appliances, furnishings, internet infrastructure, grocery stores, healthcare, and roads. At the time of the CPA, in a country twice the size of Germany, there were approximately 10 kilometers of paved roads. Inflation rates went through the roof. For almost 50 years, the South had had no truly functioning education system, a patchwork at best. Arabic had been forced upon the South as the lingua franca. In most of largely rural South Sudan, the cows were the common coinage exchanged for brides, ensuring and expanding family, wives, labor, and the wealth for a minority of the population. Unskilled labor was the main drive of the economy in the days before the discovery of oil in Muglad and later the Heglig and Unity fields. With the arrival of the world on Juba's doorstep, skilled labor poured in from surrounding countries, with the Ethiopians building hotels and restaurants, the Kenyans and Nigerians building roads and other infrastructure, Congolese and Ugandans providing social services from basic healthcare to haircuts and cobblery. In 2011, mere weeks after the jubilant celebrations, cattle rustling and ancient animosities resumed with a shocking ferocity. Cattle rustling's toll expanded exponentially, fed by decades of civil war and a demobilized but not disarmed warrior population. Small arms circulated like sweets to be snatched up by longtime rivals and a growing underclass of young men, left out of the bride market, marginalized in an economy run by foreigners, debilitated by 5 decades without a functioning education system. Already the new government was employing the tactics that they themselves had suffered under decades of Omar al-Bashir. Inflation was out of control, further impoverishing a population struggling to find their footing. Schools were being rebuilt, but focusing on the ABCs of English literacy rather than the needed skills of the trades that would support South Sudanese to get jobs within their own economy. The fragile partnership created by Nuer and Dinka of sufficient length to create a parliament and put in place both legislative frameworks and luxurious gated housing unraveled into months of hellish slaughter in December of 2013. To the 2.5 million martyrs of North-South conflict and 4 million displaced and dispersed, 10 to 50,000 dead and 2 million were forced to leave their homes were added to the total. I remember 4 years earlier seeing those billboards expressing gratitude for those who had given their lives that independence would be theirs at last, and asking first myself and the 20 participants in the training in conflict transformation and nonviolent direct action, was it worth it? A few immediately replied with an enthusiastic yes. The rest were much slower in their response. 2 of them began to weep. It has to be worth it, they said. It has to be, it just has to be. I remember one man coming in one morning and telling a story with apologies for being late. A simple story of him brushing his teeth that morning. In the community in which he was living, everyone brushed their teeth at a gathering at the community well. He accidentally, or one man accidentally, got some toothpaste on the man beside him, and a fight broke out. And before the melee was over, 7 people had been killed. And it's the story that continues to play out today in the burgeoning refugee camps of northern Uganda, in Rhino and Bidi camps, where Dinka and Nuer, many of them former child soldiers, are still struggling to find an elusive peace. I was to be in Bidi camp in March and April of this year, but for obvious reasons did not do that. And the work was all about working with Dinka and Nuer, but also with women and former child soldiers in their attempts to create models of peaceful living together for Nuer and Dinka before they returned home. I also, the executive director of our partner organization in Juba was arrested a week ago, and his crime, in fact, he and the whole staff were arrested, but they were released and he alone was kept in prison, was that they had launched a campaign in demanding accountability, transparency, and an end to nepotism and corruption in the South Sudanese government. And I just got a message an hour ago that Moses Monday John has been released from prison. But all of these point to a difficult future for South Sudan. So my intention here was to give those 2 snapshots. What is left unsaid, and perhaps we'll go into it in the Q&A. Why? What are the differences in these 2 situations? In many cases, people who are involved in both situations and taking leadership roles. So thank you.
Okay, Leanne, thank you very much. And thanks to all 3 of our speakers. And now we have 15 minutes for Q&A. And so are there any questions or issues anyone would like to raise?